All right, we're going to get started. My name is Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm the executive director at Two Feathers Native American Family Services, a co-sponsor of this event. I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, Yurok, and Talawa. It's a great honor to be able to say a few words at the beginning of such a great event. And it's so awesome to see all of you attend. I know our team at Two Feathers, in collaboration with Lark and Queer Humboldt, has been so excited for this event. So, it's been such great collaboration, sort of community organizing to bring this to our area. This talk, I would even call it a movement to raise awareness to the importance of celebrating all identities, celebrating all people, and uplifting the beauty of everyone. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lark to say a few more words, but thank you for everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm Lark Doolin, and as the executive director of Queer Humboldt, I'm working on filling the gaps in resources for our Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA youth and adults in our community. And this opportunity is incredibly exciting to me. I want to share a little bit about how this moment came to be. So in my work, I am partnering with a variety of educators at Hoopa High School. We're the Rainbow Task Force, and we're working on making the school not only safe for Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA youth, but ultimately a place of liberation. And in our work, we discovered a gap in resources and supports for our queer-identified Indigenous youth and our Two-Spirit youth. And so we were doing some research, and we started reaching out to people near and people far, looking at opportunities locally and beyond to see what we can do to fill that gap. And in the process of that research, one day I was doing some research online about Two-Spirit, and I saw a picture. And it was a picture of Harlan. He was just sitting, smiling at a camera, wearing a blue button-down. And I saw that picture, and it felt like time slowed down. And I felt my heart open. And there was this profound sense of something important happening. And so I clicked on the link and I started looking at Harlan's work, and I realized I've been using Harlan's work for years. I've been referencing it. I've been drawing from it. A few years ago, I saw an article on changing language from LGBTQ to 2S/LGBTQIA+. And I went to Queer Humboldt and we changed all of our website, reframed our word to put Two-Spirit first, because Two-Spirit people were here first, and that made sense. And so the more I started researching, the more I realized, oh, wow, this is someone who might be able to help. And so I reached out, and I've only sent fan mail twice in my life. Once was to Leonard Cohen. He did not respond, but Harlan did. And we went back and forth a couple of times, and I was so excited. And Harlan called me up, and he said, because I had said, hello, thank you for your time. I was going through the internet and I saw your picture and my heart opened, and I am doing this work with this community, and we are looking for support. Would you be able to spare 15 minutes or 20 minutes with a phone call or a Zoom? We could pay you for your time. Could you help us kind of get started in terms of what we can do to increase capacity? And Harlan responded, yeah, and called me and said, hey, I'm going to be in California with some of my team. How about we come to Humboldt and do a couple of events, and we won't charge? And I said yes. And thus began the last 5-6 weeks of pulling together a range of community partners to pull this event off and tomorrow's event that will take place at Hoopa High School. And I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge some of the people who made this happen. So first, I just want to name Ty Parker from Two Feathers. I love when I get to work with Ty on events. They are so skilled, and they're also my board president at Queer Humboldt, and so it's a delight to partner on this project. But there were a lot of other people too, people who attended Zoom plannings, people who drove vans from Hoopa so that high school students could be here, people who arrived early to help set up, people who are helping tomorrow. And so I'd love to just take a moment, if you're one of those people who have helped in some way, would you please rise and be acknowledged? Yeah. Nora, yeah. And there's about 3 times that number that are actually here than actually stood up. There's so much I could say to introduce Harlan, but I'm not going to take up much more of your time. His work on the Two-Spirit Journal is inspiring. Check it out if you haven't seen that journal. His work running the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, supporting communities like ours and expanding capacity, is also deeply inspirational. But I think one of the things I appreciate most about the work that I've gotten to do with Harlan over the last few weeks is the way that he leads with his heart. And I find that deeply inspiring. So please join me in welcoming Harlan.
So many folks. My heart is like so happy. Tansay, natutumtik Harlan Pruden, ewaka no mani, niha, nīhiyo, niha ayakwe. Gunanas wawa. You have to help me with my big Cree thick tongue. I'm going to miss Yoruk. Yoruk. Thank you. Hoopa. Karuk. Yes. Wiat. Wawa. 4 nations. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden. My Indian name, and I do use the I word, you can ask me why later, of why I use the I word, is actually in Sioux. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation, and the Sioux Nation, Marcy the Eagle Bear, organized a naming ceremony. And so they gave me the name Waka no Mani. Waka being spirit, like good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. You know, I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck up a lot of space, which I hope I don't do, and do nothing. So that part of my name is a responsibility of how do I want to show up. And so I try to show up with good actions, good words, good thoughts. And when I fall short of that intention, a mistake is only a mistake if we don't learn from it. And so every misstep or mistake is a learning opportunity in my world. Nom is two, and mani is a sacred journey. So I was going to get that translated into Cree. I am First Nations Cree. My mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father's from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. 2 different reservations, but the same signatories to Treaty 6. And so I'm a Treaty 6. We have numbered treaties in Canada. And I also said in my introduction that I am Two-Spirit in my own language, Niha Ayakwe. And so it does my heart so good that I can talk a little bit and share with you some of the teachings around what and who Two-Spirit people are. Or Two-Spirit then and now, reclaiming our place of honor, respect, and dignity for our gender and sexuality diverse Indigenous people within your respective nations. So, and I also said in my language a big thank you so much for the host nations, as well as all of the people that have brought us and worked so hard to come here today. Now, how many folks have seen this genderbread person? Yeah, right? So this genderbread person, I have to walk around. My pen has to go in my hair, just in case I have to write a note. So for the genderbread person, and I went back to the first genderbread person, right? There's like genderbread, there's the gender unicorn, there's 2.0, 4.0, but I go back to the first one because the first one informs all of the next ones, right? And we can kind of say that within this conversation, there are these concepts of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time because these concepts. So gender identity is an internal conversation of like, what is my gender identity, right? And for me, in my Cree way, I would say that I'm a Yakwe. in a Western kind of way, I may say two-spirit, or I may say a man, right? And here they have this binary of like on one extreme woman and the other side man, and then in between there's many other terms, but they just use like gender queer. Gender expression is how do you express that gender? Like the mere act of sitting can be gendered, right? Like I can sit like this, the man spread, right? Or I could like sit like this, right? So the mirror, we genderize everything, and we express it within what we wear, how we walk, even how we sit. And so your gender expression, again, is from masculine, feminine, and then this androgyny that's in the middle. Biological sex is just a physical description, right? And so it's like sex characteristics, male or female, and that's if you have primary and secondary male characteristics, and if you have primary and secondary female characteristics, and if you have a blend of those, it's intersex. And sexual orientation, this is a little bit, these three concepts are me, myself, and I. If I were alone on a desert island, I would have a gender identity. I would express that gender. Those coconut shells would be rocking. And I would also have a sex. Sexual orientation is a little bit different. So it's an internal conversation. I find someone attractive. But if we don't know the assignment, the sex of who I find attractive, we can't make no sense of sexual orientation. So there's an internal conversation, but you need an external piece of information to validate that. I, as a male-assigned individual, find another male-assigned individual attractive. We would say that that's homosexual. We say gay. I, as a male-assigned individual, find a female-assigned individual. We'd say that is bisexual. If I were female-assigned, found someone female, lesbian, right? And so sexual orientation is it's an internal dialogue, but we have to get that information of who do we find, what's the assignment of who we find attractive. So I was like, oh, this is cool, right? And both for genderbread, I was like, two-spirit is going to be really kind of hard to plot within that. And then I found this was a little Nanook relative, someone who's Inuit, right? Because you can see the little parka, right? And it's and I was like, but it's still rooted within this Western understanding of gender identity, gender expression, within this binary, biological sex. And they bifurcated attraction to romantic and sexual. But it's still firmly rooted, and I would have a really difficult time of plotting out two-spirit within this framework. Gone are our roles, gone are this cultural understanding. It's also this binary of gender and gender identity. And so I was like, I can't use this framework, and we have to go back to our old ways of thinking. And so this is where we will be talking about our old understandings that predate these Western frameworks around sex, sexuality, as well as gender, both identity and expression. So we'll be talking about two-spirit people. This is a piece of graffiti that hangs near the Granville Street Bridge, and Corey Bullpit, who is cisgendered and a Coast Salish relative and straight. And the name of the piece is called Respect. And so if you want, you can come to Vancouver and you'll see under one of the bridges, this is our graffiti, which is kind of cool, right? So first of all, the concept of two-spirit. This is the closest thing you're going to get to a definition of what two-spirit is. And it's really not a definition, it's a framework. And I'll explain why we can't give you a definition for what two-spirit is. So first of all, two-spirit is a community organizing tool or strategy and not an identity. Implicit with identity is an endpoint. Kind of like when I came out as gay. Then I had to go, what is gay, who is gay, and then I started looking, I moved downtown and I found the gay community, and then I got schooled in what it was to be gay, right? And then I started fleshing out my identity as a gay man. Well, for two-spirit is a way for us to identify those individuals who are indigenous to Turtle Island and have some sort of non-binary or sexuality and gender diversity. And when those two come together, then it opens up the possibility for someone to answer the call of Two-Spirit. If you're not Indigenous and you're not like LGBTQI, and the list goes on, diverse, sexual, and gender diverse people, you can't use the term Two-Spirit. And that sounds harsh, right? But, if everyone and anyone can use Two-Spirit, then my job as someone who's working with Indigenous people who are gender and sexuality diverse people, i.e. Two-Spirit, if everyone can use that term, then my job as a community organizer of working with Indigenous people becomes nonsensical. Because I'd be like, hey, Two-Spirit community, we're doing, and everyone shows up, right? So it has to be only reserved for Indigenous people who don't see themselves within this binary of masculinity or femininity. And so it's much more richer that, again, we're problematizing what it is. The term Two-Spirit doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized with an Indigenous or Native framework or community. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Within a traditional setting, pre-contact, Two-Spirit was a gender analysis and not a sexual orientation. It was about your role within society, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on to explain what that means. Today, most people associate the term with LGBT, IQI+, Indigenous people or Native people. However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, elders, and community members is more akin to this traditional understanding that predate these Western notions of like LGBT. So where did Two-Spirit come from? So those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition, we had our own words within our own languages that named, accounted, and identified our Two-Spirit relatives. Like at the beginning of the talk when I was introducing myself, I didn't say I was a man, niha napueo, nor did I say I was a woman, niha esquea. I said niha ayakwe. Ayakwe is how we would define Two-Spirit, right? And so we had our own words, and I'm going to be sharing 9 slides of some of the words of who we are and who we were within our respective nations in a little bit. Now, I put 1492 because 1492 was a big year for us, right? Huge, right? I know. That's when like CC, I don't even use their real name, I just say CC, right? That's when CC like happened upon our shores, right? Plants the Spanish flag and goes, ha ha, I've discovered you. Well, did you? We're like, thank goodness, right? Here we are just like lost in our big old continent, roaming around these 2 oceans. Thank you for finding us. The counter-narrative of that is on October 10th, 1492, the Indigenous people of what we would call the Greater Antilles, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. That's our framework. And so we always must ask ourselves, what is the framework that's at play? Because from a European perspective, they discovered us. From our lens, we discovered them. We must hold those 2 truths and we push them into concert with one another. Because they're truths. But there's a broader framework that we must draw into attention. And so I share that with like, what are those frameworks? Anyway, 1492 to around 1989 is when a conversation began, but in 1990, between those periods, the term Berdache was used. And Berdache was kind of a yucky word. There was these French missionaries that were wandering around Turtle Island, and they saw these like male-assigned individuals that were hanging out and doing the work of women, and female-assigned individuals that were hanging out with the men and going on war parties and like going on hunts, right? And the French missionaries are like, this doesn't fit into my rigid binary gender system in which that there are only men and women. Just like the good book said, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? So like, what do we call them? What do we call them, right? And so there was this Persian word, barja, that was spread throughout Europe. It first showed up in Italian, bardasso. Then it showed up in Spanish, bardaxa. And then in the early early 16th century, about 1525, it shows up in French as berdache. But if we go back to that Persian word barja, it literally translates into a young man or boy who serves as a succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's a crazy A word. succubus, succubus. Or permitting sodomy to be committed upon him, or, there's lots of definitions, or a passive homosexual partner. Okay, what are they actually saying, right? So on man hot sex, and we hope it's hot because it's just a waste of time when it's not, right? You're like, beige. Yes, beige. I should paint the ceiling beige. I jest. No, I don't. So in man hot sex, right, there is what we would call is, in medical terms, we would say the anal male receptive partner. We call those bottoms. And when they're not passive, like we call those power bottoms for lazy tops, right? What they were narrowly talking about was the anal male receptive partner, a passive homosexual partner. And so for many, many years, the term berdache was used. But starting in 1975, in the Bay Area, with Barbara Cameron, Randy Burns, and other community leaders, they formed the first ever organizing effort, and it was called the Bay Area, the Gay American, can you just go to one slide? No, 2 slides. No, one more. There. The Bay Area Gay American Indian Organization, back there. And they started this organizing effort, and once they started getting the native people together, they're like, who are you, and what is, like, and so this is where that conversation started here in California, is one of the sites that it began. But then in 1989, they began a conversation, but in 1990, at the 3rd annual Basket and Bow Gathering, there was this grand talking circle that was called of the attendees. And it was in Canada, in Winnipeg, just outside of Winnipeg. And at that talking circle, they said, we hate this word berdache. We hate this word berdache. One, it's because it's French. Okay, no, they didn't say that. They said, no, we hate this word. It's all about like he and him. It's not honoring of or inclusive of our Two-Spirit sisters. It's base. It's only about sex. It's about a particular role within sex. And for a whole host of reasons, they said, we reject it. But then the work for the attendees was like, how do we organize, and how do we organize within a multinational or a transnational state? Because there was representatives from the Sioux Nation, the Ojibwe Nation, the Cree Nation. And so they were like, how do we organize within a pan-Indian framework? And so after many, many rounds and much discussions, they landed on the term Two-Spirit. They wanted a term that reflected a combination of both masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there we get a pivot. The pivot was your role, i.e. gender, and a pivot away from sexuality. And so it baked into it, but it was a completely political act. It was an act of a solidarity and a statement of sovereignty of land and sovereignty of body. That the community was like saying, you French missionaries, you members of the academy, that you named us, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us. Now, the academy was flummoxed. They were like, what do you mean we can't use Two-Spirit? What do you mean the community says no? We're the experts. And I've seen papers written up until 1996 that still use the term berdache. So if you see a paper that uses berdache, I'd say use a pen, not a pencil, cross it out and write Two-Spirit. The scholarship may hold true, but the nomenclature or the berdache is highly offensive. We take it as offensive. It's base. It's not an inclusive term. And it's about sex as opposed to your role within society. So, next slide. So there are some challenges to the use as well as the utilization of the term Two-Spirit. Not So when you meet someone who's indigenous and someone who may be queer or queer identified, you cannot make the assumption that, one, they even know what Two-Spirit is, or that they use it and claim it. Again, because it's a community organizing tool, right? So there is this generational divide. For our elders and older members of our community, when they came out as gay or lesbian, it was a horrific experience. Like if you look back into the 1950s or 60s or even in the 70s. And so when they said, I'm a gay Indian or I'm a lesbian Indian, or they were like beaten from their communities and around, like, and so they have a lot vested in that pronunciation of that they're gay or lesbian. And we're like, okay, cool. You don't have to use the term Two-Spirit, but let's get to know one another. For our younger people and community members is that they may not know this teaching because we don't have curriculums. We don't have spaces like this that we can share these teachings. And for our younger people is for you to know these teachings and to see whether or not you want to use these or not. But if you don't know it, you don't know if you can use it. So these are really great spaces for you to learn this and then figure out, should I use this term Two-Spirit? Or is there a better term, or what can we do? Hiram Catholicing example. Hiram Catholicing is a leader within the Two-Spirit movement. They are Blackfoot. Because the Blackfeet Nation goes both in Canada and the United States. And so within Canada, you'll always know that they're on the Canadian side of the border because they say that they're Blackfoot. And if someone on the US side says that they're Blackfeet, they're the same people, you know that they're US. So I was like trying to place. So anyway, Hiram Catholicing is a Two-Spirit leader, and they don't use the term Two-Spirit. And why they don't use the term Two-Spirit is they want to know that if they go before their community and say, I am Two-Spirit, that they will be up to the responsibility that comes along with that they can do the role that is expected for them within their Blackfoot Nation. So one day when they think that they can meet that responsibility, they will start identifying as Two-Spirit and within their own language. Within some languages, like the Navajo or Dene language, Two-Spirit, when you translate two and spirit into their language, it means not a cool thing. And so like for a lot of our Navajo relatives, they won't use Two-Spirit, but they will use their own language of Nadle. And so we must create a space of like, oh, they don't use Two-Spirit, but we should honor their use of their language of Nadle. And then the grammar of the Two-Spirit, like it's like people are like, Two-Spirit, no, I have one spirit. No, I have three spirits, right? But Two-Spirit is just a placeholder. Like literally the community could have agreed to it being purple cats as a term of organizing, or like the golden unicorns. It's just a placeholder, just so that we can organize and identify those individuals who are indigenous and are the sexual and gender diverse folks is who we want to talk to. So it's just, and again, it's not an identity, and we'll share that in a little bit. Or the term of the use of twin spirit. I know Karen Vignault from the Kumeyaay Nation down in San Diego uses the term twin spirit. And we're like, okay, cool, right? So how do we understand a world that has more than two genders, right? So this list is a survey. I just looked across Turtle Island and I just picked and chose a couple of examples. Each of these are nation-specific. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but I'm going to do is to compare the Cree compared to the Sioux, so that you can get a basic understanding, right? Okay, for this example, okay, if I made you all a part of the Cree Nation, right? First of all, how does it feel to be a part of the best nation in the whole wide world? Like, there's one other Cree person here, I know. Yes. She's like, we're going to get beat up in the parking lot later. Like, shut up, Harlan, shut up. Okay, so if we were part of the Cree Nation, we had two big dominant camps or societies, right? We had the Napweo, men, and y'all hunted and went out on war parties, right? And we had the Esquia. Y'all were what we would say women, right? And y'all gathered, right? Now, there was a lot more to your roles, but I'm just making it simple, hunting, gathering, right? You also spoke different languages. Well, no, you spoke different technical language, like no different from the technical language like in a university setting, like when you do JRSJ 452, that course, right? If you were a part of our school, you would understand what I just said, right? So there was a technical language of the men around hunting and going on war parties, and there was a technical language that the women used around gathering. Now, also the way that us Crees, how we worked, is that a man was never allowed in a woman's camp and a woman was never allowed in a man's camp. Well, was that good? Was that bad? Well, that's just how we organized. We'll suspend judgment of whether or not that's good or bad, right? And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two camps, Nēhiyo couldn't walk over to the Esquia camp and go, hey, Esquias, what's going on, right? And Esquia couldn't walk over to the men's camp and go, what are you silly gooses up to today, right? But us as a Yahweh, guess what? We were schooled in both of your techne of hunting, techne of gathering. And thereby we were also schooled in your technical language, Nēhiyo, and your technical language of women, of the Esquia. But we were the only people that had unfettered and equal access to both camps. And so if there was disharmony or discord or imbalance, we could float over to the women's camp. We're like, hey, women, what's going on? What's happening? What's a skinny? Oh, hey, men, what's going on? What's going on, right? Oh, I'll be right back. Hey, folks, there seems to be a little bit of communication error. Like, this is what the guys are saying, right? This is what the women are saying. Why don't we work it out? And so we played this mediator role between the two camps. A Nēhiyo couldn't do this, and a Esquia couldn't do this, just we could do it. And I remember when I started this work like 20 years ago, I thought that we were the bomb, right? And I was like, how great, right? But I realized that what I was doing was something that was wrong. That would be like me saying that what the men did was more important than all the other camps. No, it was just, that was your role. Your role was to hunt. Your role was to go on war parties. Your role was to gather. Our role was to mediate. And as a result of that, I was like no different than anyone else. I just had a different role within society that didn't make me any specialer. It just made me having a different role within society. And it's just adding to the diversity and the hum of the greater of good. So if I were Sue, there wouldn't be this like social expectation that I would be a mediator, but there would be a social expectation that I would be the facilitator or the leader or the officiant of a naming ceremony. So my good friend Del First, who is Sue, and Winkday, now does that ceremony. And he does naming ceremonies. And so, again, it's your role within society. The big takeaway for this is that Two-Spirit is going to mean something different if you're Cree, if you're Sioux, if you're Lakota, if you, like, all of the different nations. And that's why we can't say all Two-Spirits do this. Because you can see how, like, even between our Cree examples and the Sioux examples, they're two different. So that's why we have to offer a framework. And also, if we offered an example, a definition of this is what Two-Spirit is, that makes it the identity. It cannot. Two-Spirit means something different depending on what nation you are, and you'll have a different role within societies because it'll be distinct to your nation. So I've collected about 130 terms, building off of Willie Roscow's work, and he worked with Barbara Cameron and Randy Burns, as well as other members of the Gay American Indians organizations in the Bay Area. I have been adding to this database. Now, I must say that the next 9 slides, there is inaccuracies, there's missing information, and then there's flat out wrong information. And you're like, tap the brakes, Harlan. Why are you getting out misinformation? Well, I'm sharing the next 9 slides is because it's based off of the work of Willie Roscoe, and I'm constantly updating this database. I wish that I could sit up in the ivory tower, comb through this database. I do a triple validation process when I enter in I don't just take the first word of the first primary language speakers. I try to find 2 other language speakers to affirm the findings. So I'd go through a multi-validation process. If I were to do that, that could take a lifetime. It could take 3 lifetimes. And in those intervening lifetimes, I get a beautiful, clean, shiny, without error. But we've lost 3 years of this, conversations. So I offer you these next 9 slides as conversation starters. If you see your nation up there, go, is that the right word? Is that the good translation? Is there something better? If you don't see your nation, go, I have to go talk to my old ones. Do we have this word? And if you find that word, I hope that you would share it with me so that I could update the database. Right now I'm working with the Stolo Nation, and the elders are gifting me their words. And so we'll be adding, again, a more entry into this. And so I encourage you is if you see your nation, validate it. I'm not going to say it's true, but if you don't see your nation, then maybe lean into the conversation to see whether or not we do have a word within your language for your people. The Cree entry is a good, clean entry. It was validated by 21 primary Cree speakers. And I want to point to the thing of this, esquiakan, napuakan, that literally translates into fake woman or fake man. But my elders assured me it's the brutality of English. You could say pretend man or pretend woman, but even within that positionality, it seems like you're not. But it's just English obscures a lot of things. But they said it wasn't a negative term, but that's the translation that we have. Next slide. Next slide. I'm working on the translation for these Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee people. I love that first term. I will not try to pronounce that word, but they have a pattern, and it was for both male and female assigned individuals. What does that mean? It's giving you a peek in, they have a pattern? What, the richness of that, what the heck does that mean within their way of thinking about gender? And it's so cool. And then I'm trying to work on these other 2 translations. This Nuchalnath entry, the Nuchalnath people are in the northern Vancouver Island. And these words were gifted to me right before the pandemic by this Nuchalnath cultural advisor. And then we validated it. And I remember doing a talk like this for some Indigenous youth out at Loon Lake. And I had a Nuchalnath elder, Lillian Howard. Lillian Howard, she's transitioned to the spirit world. But she came to me with tears in her eyes. And she said, I really wish that my relatives would have known of these words before they took their life. Because it's been about 75 years since these words, the Nuchalnath words, have been shown in a public sphere. Even the Nuchalnath people don't know these words, and so I'm trying to share these words with the Nuchalnath people. Next slide. Again, working on the translation for the Seneca. That's another Haudenosaunee nation. Guasala is another northern BC nation. And again, it's probably been around 100 years since these words have been shown in a public sphere. But I also love is that if you look at the translation, a man who lived, there's a typo. There should be no S there. I thought I corrected that, as a woman. So they don't have tense in their language. The language is it's both past, present, and future of live, lives, and lived. And that's kind of cool. So it's giving a little peek into how they conceive of their language through these definitions. The Tlingit entry, I'm working on that right now. And we see some of these things that seem really negative, and that's why I put them in quotations. I know that we're working with some folks in Tlingit, and that's like northern BC, southern Yukon, and Alaska. So when the ethnographer, more than likely when the ethnographer said, "What does that word mean?" The Tlingit people are like, "Oh, they don't fight. They don't go on war parties, right?" And the Westerner goes, "We have a word for that." Coward. We'll translate that to coward, right? And so, again, we just have to work on getting cleaner and better translations, but until I can get like 3 people to agree on a translation, it just stays as a loose translation now. So yeah, these are some of the work. So how we use Two-Spirit as a community organizing tool is like, hey, Two-Spirit community, we're doing a talk at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Arcata. But if the individual who shows up is Zuni and male assigned, then what we do is we gift, and they don't know their word, we gift them their word Lahamana. And then the medicine of these words begins the inquiry and this deep centering of your ingenuity. I've seen it so often in which that people are like called nasty names living in their community as like, vag and queer and dyke and all that stuff. Or worse, they're like run out of their communities. They go off into an urban setting where they find the queer community, only to come to a Two-Spirit gathering. And if they're male assigned and Zuni, we gift them their word Lahamana and a framework. And then the medicine and the magic of these words is like, who is Lahamana? What is Lahamana? And what is my role and purpose as a Lahamana for my Zuni people? And roots and calls them back home. And only they can answer that question. I'm not Zuni. I'm Cree. I know what it is to be a Yahweh. I don't know what it is to be, because I'm not Zuni, right? And so that's what these words do, is it reconnects those potentially queer indigenous youth and people back to their ingenuity. And then resurrecting and finding out who are they. And that, I think, is the power of these words, because where there's a word, there's a people, there's a story, and there's a history and a lived and embodied experience. And it's also a reminding of who were we before colonization. What were our medicines? What was our purpose? And what was our role within society that we offered? We're not alone. If you look at other indigenous communities across the world, although they wouldn't use Two-Spirit, Two-Spirit is only here for Turtle Island, because those were the only people that were there in 1990, right? But there is that same sort of gender diversity, like you have the Mahu in Hawaii, the Fa'afafine in Samoa, the Hidra and the Bulbul in India and in Pakistan. And again, this is incomplete. There were many other nations that had multiple genders prior to colonization. So there are only about 20 known historical images of our Two-Spirit relatives. And so you're seeing probably about 50% of, 58% of the known images. So we have Wiwa from the Zuni Nation. We saw their plaque yesterday. There's this entire biography that's called Wiwa, Man, Woman, written by Willie Roscoe, and it details how Wiwa was taken to DC and was like going to like state dinners, and everyone was like, wow, this is beautiful, right? And Wiwa was like an amazing artisan. And so I think it was Grover Cleveland at that time said, hey, Wiwa, let me have my presidential doctor to do a physical on you, right? And so the presidential doctor came in, pulled up Wiwa's tunic and found a big old boy part. And they're like, freak! Why are you wearing a dress? Get out of here. And they ran Wiwa in disgrace out of DC because they thought that they were like, but Wiwa was only being Wiwa. And you can kind of see when this younger picture of Wiwa, You have all of the young boys, all of the young girls, and where's Wiwa in that picture? Smack dab in the middle, holding that liminal space between these two groups and these two camps. Over here is that we really have few pictures of our indigenous sisters, our Two-Spirit sisters. We have this one picture of Lozen alongside their wife Dotesi, and Lozen fought alongside Geronimo. Lozen was known as a warrior woman. And then we don't actually have a picture, but we have this lithograph of Chief Bar Chiampe from the Crow Nation. Chief Bar Chiampe were known for their courageousness, their incredible tacticianer as a war. So there were 13 fires that make up the Crow Nation. Chief Bar Chiampe became the chief of one fire, and because they proved themselves in battle so much, they became the chief of chiefs, the chief of all 13 fires. Female assigned, Two-Spirit. You can read some of the stories in the archive that Chief Bar Chiampe had 4 wives because they could manage 4 households because they had so much status within their community. I've also read some really cool accounts that when the opposing camp would see the charge being led by Chief Bar Chiampe, that they would just put down their armaments. They're like, all right, today's not a good day to die. Y'all have this one. We'll come back later, maybe, right? Because they were known for their fierceness and their courageousness within battle, and they were female assigned. We also have another famous Crow Two-Spirit male assigned, Otish. And Otish comes, and there's a bunch of names for Otish. There was Squaw Jim. There's also finds them and kills them, or Otish. So they had 3 different names. Otish, this is really interesting. And I was just reflecting upon this last night when I was talking to Marcus, another elder in our movement, of like how Otish, when the Crow Nation were put on a reservation, the Indian agent, the first Indian agent for the Crow people, they stripped Otish of all of their female regalia and put them into male regalia because they wanted them to, to look like a man because they had a boy part. And the community freaked out. So much so the Indian agent was like dismissed and they brought in another Indian agent. But Otish, and so that was also the power that we had and the support that we had in community at that time. I was like, you cannot disrespect our Two-Spirit relative. In Crow, how you say Two-Spirit is Bota. So you cannot disrespect our Bota, is what the Crow people said. And then Otish, back in the the mid 1800s, Otish was like seeing the reservation system and how that the other people were solely like disrespecting our Two-Spirit relatives. And Otish put a call out and started gathering the Two-Spirit people from all the various nations and so Otish is probably one of our first Two-Spirit community organizers. Know that this fight has been going on since the beginning and the founding of the reservation systems for the Crow Nations, that we must organize and we find strength when we come together. I think that's the teaching that I take from Otish, and I am so blessed that I got to learn a little bit about Otish. This is one of the only Canadian images. 2 men from Moose Mountain, but you can clearly see that there's something going on here. So this individual is fully expressed as a male, a tunic, war bonnet, leggings, an axe, arrows. This individual, there's something funky going on, right? Female breastplate, shawl, female tunic, and a skirt. This war bonnet is out of place, but also the notation, or the coding that goes along with this picture is 2 men from Moose Mountain. And so right now I'm working with Treaty 4 folks in southern Saskatchewan to see if we can identify some of the relatives of the individuals that are pictured and to find out what is really going on in this image. And so that's a part of the work that I'm doing. This is Hustin Kla of the Navajo Nation, Nadle. And Hustin was just an amazing Huston is credited with coming up with a new weaving style for the Navajo people that are still carried on today. Could you imagine that you come up with like a new piece of jewelry or a new way of doing something that then all is picked up by your people? That's what we did, is that we created new things that are picked up by our entire, like a basket weaving style that's still carried on today. I put myself in the archive. I didn't know I was Two-Spirit at this time. I still grow. And for whatever reason, my fly is down. I don't know why my mama didn't go. But I also want to point that out so you're not looking like, why did that guy have that picture of himself with the fly down? I draw attention to it. So that all kind of came to an end. So this is a lithograph that hangs in the Spanish National Archive. The painting of it hangs in the Spanish Archive. There are lithographs of this that hang in special collections within the New York City Public Library on 42nd and 5th. And this is accounting the story of Vasquez Núñez de Balboa, who in 1513 would be roaming the land of Panama, Panama today. And he found folks who were having males having same-sex sexual relations. So what did he do? He rounded them all up and had a big old party. No. He rounded them all up and he fed them to their war dogs. No. He rounded up the berdashes, the bottoms, not the tops, and fed the bottoms to the dogs, the berdashes. This begins the story of the colonization of us as indigenous people and the eradication of Two-Spirit teachings, ways, knowledges. This is where we began going underground. We started hiding them. Or, our elders would say to us, like, no, put on pants. But after 2 or 3 generations of people not talking about it, then those same people are like, we don't have a Two-Spirit tradition. One was motivated out of love that facilitated an erasure. Look, we're not going to talk about it anymore. But then after that person is gone, they're gone. And we don't have those teachings, right? And then the other narrative is just pure violence. And they were just beating our gender diversity and our sexuality diversity out of our people and fashioning the world that they only can see. But I also if you look at this is just pure propaganda. If you see here is the brightly colored celebratory conquistadors, the Spanish. And then down here is this carnal, dark, sexual. And so this is pure propaganda. And again, this painting doesn't give us meaning. We bring meaning to the painting. Going back to that, who discovered us or were we discovered? What's the framework? Now, if you think, oh, goodness, it's good to be a God-fearing continental European, and we're bringing civilization to those dirty, disgusting Indians, you will go, wow, what a great picture. When I look at this from an indigenous framework and someone who is Yahweh or Two-Spirit, I look at this with just pure vileness and hatred. We bring meaning to the painting. The painting doesn't bring meaning to us. What is that framework that's at play? And question those frameworks. Now, we cannot talk about colonization and the impact of colonization until we figure out what's going on in this picture. How many folks have seen this picture before? Yeah. So this is a picture of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was the first Indian residential school, and it opened in 1879 and closed in 1918. And it was founded by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, this army dude that didn't have one educational class. He was an army dude. And he prided himself on beating people into submissions. At this one school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, about 100,000 Native children went through its doors while it was open from 1879 to 1918 from approximately 140 different nations. Do you know how many students they graduated from this school? 158. Total, not per year, out of 100,000 Native children, 158 got a grade 12 matric. And yet it was hailed as some huge, huge success. Could you imagine your high school? If that stat was your high school, you would be closed. No, we just gave more money. The Canadian government, John A. Macdonald, sent Duncan Scott down to Carlisle to study this model, and they went back to Canada and they replicated this model. Hitler sent ambassadors over to this. And the final solution is based off of this model. So what does this have to do with being Two-Spirit? Well, this has everything, and this has nothing to do with Two-Spirit. And you're like, wait, how can it be everything and nothing, right? If we deconstruct the subject matter of this picture, you will see that in this part, and I'm going to make the assumption that these are all male-assigned individuals, and why I'm assuming they're male-assigned individuals because of their gender expression, and they're all like expressed as young men or boys, and that's coded by hair over the ear, haircut over the ears, the blazer and the pantsuit. And then down here are all of our young women and girls, and their gender expression is shoulder-length hair and skirts. I know that there are Two-Spirit people there, just as I know there's Two-Spirit people here in the audience. I also know that there's straight people in the audience, right? Like this is probably a sample, right? So we're there. But we as Two-Spirit people, we're not forced to the margins. We're forced completely out of this framework, leaving room for only their two genders. And it is that rigid imposition of the gender binary that was imposed upon us as Indigenous people. And then from 1879 to 1918, for all those young kids that were like, their Indianness were beaten out of them. We have stories in which that if this one young individual was caught speaking their language, and they had a pin driven through their tongue. Because they knew that if they could break the language, they couldn't go home and talk to their old ones to get the knowledge. They could break the culture if they broke the language. And they can impose their ways of knowing and being on us. So that there's only two genders. Gone are the third, fourth. There were some nations that had 12 different genders. Gone are all of those genders, leaving room for only their two genders. So that is why this picture has everything, and this has nothing to do with Two-Spirit. We're there, just that you can't see us. And it is that gender policing that I think that we still carry on today. Now, I just also want to talk on a deeply, deeply personal note, in that my mother was ripped from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve, along with my aunt, Auntie Pippi, and put into an Indian residential school outside out of Edmonton. And, you know, I've been living on my own since I was like 15. I emancipated myself. I went into the Edmonton, and I went on welfare, and the only reason why I got welfare is that I had to promise that I would go to high school. So I'm like, okay, I'll go to school. But then I also rented a room. Okay, and I was like 15. I did not make good decisions. I'm 15, right? But why I emancipated myself is because of the dysfunctionality and just the pure silliness of family life. It was safer for me to be on my own than in my own home. And so there was so much hatred that I had for this woman. And when I started looking at this picture and understanding this real, what does this picture mean? I realized that, my mother, she wasn't spoken to with kindness and love. She was beaten. She had her Indianness beaten out of her. She didn't speak to us with kindness and love. And so what I've done is through making peace and really understanding, I realized that for my mother is that she was only doing that which she knew. And so although she's passed on, and I know that my healing work with her has to be done in my own personal, but I know that today there's not a hatred or darkness in my heart. There's compassion, understanding, and appreciation of what she survived and what she went through, what she put us through. And one day I know that there will be love for her in my heart. But that's a part of the healing journey. So many people want to look at this picture and think that it's in the past. Like we're talking 1879. Like, what does it matter, right? Well, this is not history for us. I just shared that personal story because I'm still trying to heal from this garbage. This is not history, both on a deeply personal level, but as two-spirit people of working to reclaim our ingenuity of who we are so that we can speak our language, we know our ways, so that I can stand before you today and say, Niha ayakwe, Niha napweo, I am Cree. This is our work, that we must start centering of who we are as Indigenous people. Now, I also love, I don't want to be all heavy, okay? This little girl. I don't know anything about her, but she just teaches me so much. Because she's like, y'all can take my picture. So many people think that activism has to be some big, grand, heroic event. Chaining yourself to a tree, shutting down freeways. Yes, that's activism. But she tells me also that you do that which you can, and you call it a day and you call it a victory. If it is merely crossing your arms to show displeasure, you do it. Because I think it's these little acts of resistance that allows all of us as Indigenous people, we can be here today. Activism it can be big, grand acts. But you can also just cross your arms in displeasure and call it a day. And for that, I love her and the teachings that she gives me of like saying, do what you can and call it a victory. And know in your heart of hearts of why you're resisting. Because as Indigenous people, you merely breathing makes you an activist. And I think this is really hard for us to understand because we are the physical representation of this land. We are also, when we walk into a room, we are a physical representation to remind settlers that they are settlers. They can talk a good game that they think that this is their land. But we know it is not. And that is why our Indigenous women are constantly being violated. There's all this gendered violence. And there's this, like, from the schools is the eradication so that they can live on our land guilt-free. Every breath that we take is an act of survival. Every exhale is an act of resistance. Breathing makes us activists. And breathing makes you an activist. Start putting a little bit of agency into that. Start cleaning and claiming space. And reminding folks that we have knowledges that predate Western ways of knowing that are deep and rich. And then we can start decolonizing sex, sexuality, and gender. And I think that's my work. But it's also so that I can share some of these teachings with you so that you can go, who am I? What is my role? And that makes me different from our queer Indigenous relatives. And then how can we start centering our ingenuity, and then we can offer those gifts to our non-Indigenous relatives so that they may walk a gentler life. So this is, again, propaganda. And I don't know whether or not Tom Torino was Nadalé or not, but it's a before and after picture from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was only a 3-year period. So this is 1882 to 1885, like 3 years. And again, you see a perfect example of the gender policing. Like, gone are the long hairs, the adornments, the necklaces, the earrings, to the fashioning of what their conceptions of masculinity were. Next slide. Similarly, this is Thomas Keesick Moore from a Regina Indian boarding school. And again, like, relatively, it's a short time period, but again, it's that fashioning of what they conceive of what a young boy should look like. So we've been talking a little bit about historical trauma, and I'm kind of like big on definitions. And so this is a definition that I brought. There was many definitions of historical trauma. And I used the one from J.P. Gong, and then I added a little bit to his definition. You can do that. Go like, yeah, that's a good definition, but I think it can be made better. Add it in and cite yourself, right? Don't just go, that's kind of cool. No, go like, is that cool? Okay, it's not cool. We're going to change it up. Cite them. And I went back to JP, and I was like, JP, can I amend? And he was like, absolutely. So historical trauma is a combination of immense losses and traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. And what is distinct about historical trauma is that they're 100% man-made. This is not like the Santa Clara like wildfires. This is done through policies and laws, and those policies and laws are upheld by the courts of the conquerors. For Native people, this includes the losses of culture, land, language, people, ways of life, economic systems, ceremonies, and family structures. That family structures is huge because it's your family structures that's the core building blocks for societies and nations. And if your families are being ripped apart through the residential boarding schools, can you or how can you build healthy societies and healthy nations? You can't. My question is, what's missing from that list? Or is there something missing from that list? Our two-spirit relatives, right? But I resisted the temptation of putting two-spirit as a separate bullet point. Now, because unlike the broader queer movement, the broader non-Indigenous queer movement that wants like a separate room, a separate parade, separate, like, and I understand why. Like, I'm not being critical. Like, I understand that we have to like create safe spaces for our own community, but then we have to integrate back into community. Like, I get that, right? But, and I know that for the broader non-Indigenous queer movement is that if you look, there's two big, well, the overarching for the work of the non-Indigenous queer movement is aspirational, dreaming of a better tomorrow. Theoretical, they're literally dreaming. And that work is in two major buckets. There's actually asking for a new right or a new privilege. And so as an example, as like gender neutral or gender inclusive washrooms within the public sphere. That's a new conversation-ish, right? Or and again, I'm fully supportive of that. I'm merely observing and reflecting. I'm not critiquing or being critical. I'm observing and reflecting. Or then the other bucket of the conversation is an expansion of a Western right. And we saw that within the discourse of same-sex civil marriages. And like, we want what they have, right? But for us within the Two-Spirit movement is that we're never asking for anything new. Where we begin the conversation is, remember when? Remember when I was a mediator? Remember when I had a distinct role within our society and I was honored for that role? It's not theoretical, nor is it's historical. It's like a lived and embodied truth. And so as a result of that, we're there. And what I just showed you is examples of how we had a cultural role. 9 slides of the language, how we are connected to the land, people, ways of life, economic systems, ceremonies like Del First, and families. We as Two-Spirit people, we're in every family. You know, you shake any family tree hard enough, and a couple of fruits will fall out. We're in every family. We're there. And see, that's what makes us different. That's why this is so hard to plot out on genderbread. Because this is where we are. We don't need to have a separate bullet point of saying Two-Spirit, because we're there already. When someone says, Harlan, who are you? I don't go, I'm a gay activist. I don't go, oh, I'm Two-Spirit. What comes out of my mouth is Niha. I'm even forgetting my own word. I am First Nations Cree, Nēhiyo. Niha, Nēhiyo. Within my statement of Nēhiyo, Ayakwe, Napueo, and gay, and who I am, I'm there with that statement. And so I see myself already there, and I'm totally affirmed. And I think that's the power of these words, is that you should claim and center who you are as an Indigenous person. And so that makes us radically different than a gay or a lesbian Indian. Because gay and lesbian are Western terms, and we slapped on Indian, where for Nēhiyo and Ayakwe, it's culturally rooted, and it is distinct to who I am as a Nēhiyo. Next. So, again, just driving this point home, and this is building upon Alex Wilson's work, that part of my work and my dream is to facilitate only the coming in process. But for many, many Native folks, what they have to do is they have to do that coming out process, and then they come in. And so, as I was sharing, is that so many Two-Spirit people, they get driven from their community, they go to an urban setting, and then they show up at a Two-Spirit gathering, and we gift them their word, and they begins that inquiry of that coming in process. So the LGBT coming out process, coming out is typically a declaration of an independent identity. It is an identity. A GLBT person musters up their courage and anticipating conflict, announces their sexuality to a friend or family member at the risk of being met with anger, resistance, violence, and flat-out rejection or abandonment. And that includes for our trans relatives when they want to come out. This is the coming out. And it's steeped in this deficit model. For the coming in process, and you heard that through the talk already, to facilitate the coming in process, is an Indigenous person who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual or trans, comes to understand their relationship to and place and value within their family, their community, their culture, their history, within a present-day setting. Coming in is not a declaration or an announcement. It is simply presenting oneself as being fully present as an Indigenous person who happens to be LGBTQI, gender nonconforming. It's a centering of their indigeneity. And I hope that one day that our young queer and young gender and sexuality diverse Indigenous people, that they don't have to come out because they were never out, that they're in, and that my dream is that we're just in at all times, and that they just come in They come in as young people and they come to their beauty, but it is also that installation of who are they as Indigenous people. That is my dream. And then we can offer those teachings to our European and our settler relatives. That's a much nice, don't you want to have a facilitating of coming in rather than this anticipating conflict met with anger, resistance, violence, and flat out ejection or abandonment? No one should experience that. How do we create a system and that people are just in? And that's my goal and my vision that I want to have for all folks, that we just facilitate the coming in. No one has to come out to come in. They're just there. So there are a lot of examples of this reclamation of and learning of these teachings. There are autobiographies. This Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time. It's an Indigenous LGBT sci-fi analogy. I'm a big sci-fier. So this is sci-fi meets Two-Spirit. I'm like, what? Stop. Tomorrow we're going to be watching a screening of Fire Song, this beautiful movie. Well, it has to be qualified. It's set on a reservation, and the harshness of living on a reservation in an Indigenous community. But we get to see ourselves and our lived experience, from a movie, which is beautiful. It's a coming of age of two Anishinaabe young male-assigned individuals of who they find themselves. And so come. That was my plug for tomorrow, okay? Two Soft Things, Two Hard Things is a beautiful documentary of our Nook relatives and the gender and sexual diversity that existed for our Inuit people. There are only there's 2 children's books. I believe I'm going to be reading, I brought all 3. There's 47,000 Beads, which was a US book. There's Eagle's Path, which is Michelle Cointreau, who is Mohawk, and she's an ally. And then there's also this beautiful story of Rainbow Crow. Rainbow Crow, the teachings are Two-Spirit inclusive, but it's not positioned as a Two-Spirit. I see the teachings as being Two-Spirit. If you want to learn more about if you want to learn more about what's going on in the Two-Spirit community, is go to the twospiritjournal.com. Hit the button once. Type in resources, and you can get a recording of a lecture like this. There's downloadable resources there. But again, for the Two-Spirit Journal, if you don't know what Two-Spirit is, the site's not going to help you, because it's written by Two-Spirit people for Two-Spirit people. And because we know who we are, we just skip to content, right? So the site is really written for us, by us. So I just built in this resource page so that you can kind of learn. But most of the content is we just skip to who we are, and we don't account for who we are because we know who we are. So in summary, Two-Spirit, the intersection of those who embody diverse sexuality, genders, roles and expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island, is a community organizing tool and not an identity. It is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or member of. Two-Spirit refers to a history or tradition that predates Western notions and concepts such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and the list can go on and on and on. And it is about reclaiming and restoring our rightful place of honor, respect, and dignity within the individual's nations. This is deep decolonizing work that centers one's ingenuity and calls Two-Spirit people home, and is thereby about mending the sacred hoop. That last point is huge. There's this Two-Spirit leader named Joey Criddle, who is Hicora Apache, Geronimo's nation. And Joey shared a prophecy that there will not be healing and wellness for Indigenous people until our Two-Spirit people are brought back to the fire. Now I think that's the vision, but it also is just an incredible vision. Because you create a space that is safe and welcoming for the least valued within your society, we all benefit from that safety. For the folks, and that's what the Rainbow Crow story is talking about, is how do we lift up the least valued within our society and we honor them? And that's this teaching that we have from the Rainbow Crow story that we could share tomorrow. And so our teachings about how we work and creating safe and welcoming spaces and spaces that are like motivated out of love is something that I think that we can offer our LGBT and non-Indigenous relatives. But we also have to do the work of who are we as Indigenous people. And we have to challenge those Western ways of knowing and replace it with our own Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. I'm getting a little old. And I look to you as young people because you are our next leaders. That's your work. And it makes my heart so happy to see so many young people. How we say a formal thank you in Cree is Kironas Skomtinina Wawa. Informally, we would just say hi hi, is how we say thank you. The closest expression that we have to goodbye is this expression Examaga. Examaga literally translates into that's it for now. The A is important. But a closer translation of Examaga is that there is no finality in Cree. That once our paths have crossed, they're forever intertwined and they will cross again, either in this life or in some other life. And also, I was thinking about this the other day. He says that our paths have already crossed. If they're crossing again now, they've crossed before. And I'm so happy that we have this time that our paths are crossing again. So it is with the greatest humility and the honor that I say, Kironas Skomtinina Wawa, hi hi, Examaga, and I look forward to the next time our paths cross, either in this life or in some other life. Thank you. All right. All right, let's go into, and I know it's like 6 o'clock. I know that we've probably gone over. Okay, we're natives. We're running on Indian times. But I challenge that. I hear that all the time in Indian country. You're like, we're running on Indian time, right? Or that time doesn't mean anything, right? Well, but it does. Like, when the salmon are running, you are out there getting the salmon. You couldn't go, no, I'll get to that next week, because then you'd starve. So we ran on time. You know, when it was hunting season and gathering, we were out there gathering, right? So I question whether or not we have Indian time. We just take a little bit longer when we're doing our relationship building and teachings. You take as much time it is, right? But we should not be late for work. No. Or school. When the salmon are running, you're out there catching that salmon, all right? All right, questions, comments, or conversations, or what I call QCC. I love making acronyms for everything. I'm going to beat the Westerners at their acronym name, because I just create acronyms all over. I'm like, all right, QCC. Yeah. Yep.
I was wondering, so I think it's amazing that for nations that don't have a word for teachers, that you were saying you give them that word. But why is it not helping them develop a word for themselves that they can use in their own language?
There is always the invitation to do that.
Okay.
There is. And I think that the way that I look at it is, first of all, every question is an act of generosity. And in my way, generosity must be met with generosity. I know that I've heard so many, and it hurts my heart to hear this all the time, when people say, we don't know the words, we don't know the teachings, we don't know our songs, we don't know our role in ceremony. because colonization has been incredibly harsh. But there's this beautiful story of this Lakota grandparent that's walking with their grandchild. And the grandchild says, Musham, what happens if they burn our tioshbe, our teepees, right? Our family. And the grandfather and the grandchild walk a little farther, and the grandparent goes, we will be okay. So they walk a little while, and then the grandchild goes, well, what happens if they burn our toshbe, our broader family? And the grandparent goes, we'll be okay. And then they walk a little, and the young grandchild started getting a little like, well, what happens if they burn our nation? And the grandparent goes, we will be okay. And the grandchild was like, how can you say that? They burn our family, they burn our utoshbe, they burn our nation. And so the grandfather was like, for the Lakota people, all of their teachings are stored and housed in the stars. And so the grandparent said that they will never burn the stars, that the teachings are always there. Try as they might to try to cut us from our land and our greatest teacher. All we have to do is, if we don't know the words, we don't know the ceremonies, we connect back out there. We can access the same teachings. Now, the song may be different. You know, the old way, the one that's forgotten, the beat may have been this, right? Today it may be a little funkier, but because it's coming from the same teacher, the teachings will be true. We are a living, evolving, surviving, resisting culture. We can come up with our own words. We can work within our societies because we're a living culture. And so a part of that is that we just connect back to our teachings and to our ways, and they will illuminate, and we will be able to access it. So you're absolutely right. Some of these teachings and some of the songs and ceremonies are gone forever, but we can access them. For our Coast Salish relatives, they should go down to the water, and the water will tell them how to be in good relations with one another. Good question. Yep.
It's not so much as a question, but I've started reconnecting and with my well-variety counselor. She pours water for sweat ceremonies, sweat lodges, and I've gotten the honor since being sober from alcohol to be fire tender and learn under her husband now. And it's almost like someone's turned up the dial. When you're tuning in a radio, it's like I can hear the songs that were already in my spirit, but I was, drowning myself with other things, and now that I'm doing this work, it really is that in us, it's in our blood. My blood remembers the smell of sage, remembers the smell of pepperwood, and all of these different things. And yeah, just thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. And that is powerful, because that's health. The centering on, what you just explained, and also for you and your healing journey and walking your truth, that's amazing. Because I think those other distractions with those health-harming coping strategies, like alcohol. And I know that we want to vilify alcohol. And as someone who struggled with alcoholism, that every day that I drank to deal with my shitty life, and I lived, it was how I coped. That's why I call it health-harming coping strategies, because it was a coping mechanism. Alcohol wasn't the problem. The problem was my shitty fucking life and the systemic and racism that I existed in. Plus the homophobia, the transphobia, the systemic racism within the queer movement. Yeah, I drank because I could avoid that. But then once I took the alcohol away, that coping mechanism, then I said, I have to find my voice. We found ceremony. And both are needed, and there's no one path that's better than the other. So I just thank you very much for on your healing journey, but this is the change that we need, because there's listening to your whispers of your ancestors. That is what we need. So thank you. Any other questions, comments, or conversations? Yeah.
Yesterday I was talking to my welding professor and also my friend and my coworker, and so we're just talking about basically everything you're talking about, but not as much knowledge backing it. We were both saying how we wanted to learn more about it, and then 3 hours before my welding class I saw the post about this.
Oh, that's so cool. A little magnet. I have lots of little goodies up here. I have tattoos. Cool. Yes.
Okay, so the description of two-spirit as related to roles. So does, is a variance of gender or sexuality enough to be two-spirit? Is that the only thing, or is there, in addition, there has to be some kind of role, some kind of, a special role in the culture? Or were there, homosexual people who were not considered two-spirit? Was there gender variance that wasn't
Right.
considered two-spirit?
And I should have talked to Lark about this, because I stripped out the 3 slides where I talk about sex. Because do y'all want me to add those 3 slides back in and we can talk about sex? Yeah? Okay, where's my... Okay, so this is a painting by George Catlin, who was this self-taught of European descent painter. And George Catlin was witnessing the impacting of colonization, where whole nations were being wiped from the face of the earth. And so he packed up his paint set and he ran out west and he started feverishly painting, right? And I know that the Sioux people, they go to the National Archive and they look at the beadwork or the coloration and the designs, and they're he captured what was really going on. This is one of the earliest documented Western documentations of our two-spirit relatives. It was painted between sometime 1861 and 1868, I think, or 69. I know that there's sketches within that period where he's trying to work out the composition of this painting. It's a relatively small painting. It's only 2 feet by 1.5 feet. And it's called The Dance to the Berdache. Again, it was 1869. Berdache was still used. And it was a painting of the Saki people, or the Saukenfax people. And it should be noted that within the writings within his journal articles, his sketchbooks, George Catlin is quoted as saying that he hopes that this two-spirit tradition be eradicated before it is more fully documented. So he wasn't a sympathizer, but he did paint this one painting, right? And it's kind of odd because the very thing that he wants is the eradication of this tradition before it is more fully documented. Well, there's the documentation. I'm thank you, George. So what's going on in this picture, or in this painting, right? So here is the male assigned two-spirit person, the Ikukua. And so for the Saki people, they had 2 chiefs. They had a camp chief, head of government and internal affairs, and they had a war chief, head of state and external relations. And it didn't matter how much a war chief said, we have to go to war. It wasn't until their head, Ikukua, gave the authorization or the declaration to go to war. Right, and then this is the cool thing about the painting, right? So the war chief has said, we got to go to war. The ikukuwa says, we can go to war, and the authorization is granted. And on the eve of the battle, the ikukuwa would walk out in the middle of the encampment, and all of the warriors would come to do a dance to the ikukuwa to see if they could catch the eye of the ikukuwa, so that they could be chosen by the ikukuwa, so they could have sex with the ikukuwa, and they could take a little bit of that ikukuwa spirit to battle the next day. What? Like, this is one ceremony I want to bring back today, right? Not that I'm celebrating wars, but come on, we were at 4 different wars when I was living here, and there was no dance. So I was like, where's my dance? I also love the painting, right? Because like the ikukuwa is like looking all coquettish, right? Like, y'all want some of the scrumptiousness? Like, work it out. Dance a little harder, not too hard. I don't want your legs tired, right?
So, how do we make sense of this painting? Like your question around like, are these warriors gay? They're vying for the sexual attention of another male-assigned individual. Are they bi? Or do we have to start thinking about sex and sexuality different? The act of sex, not biological, not sex assigned, but sex and sexuality different. And so a part of my scholarship was trying to figure out what is going on in the subject matter of this painting. And so what I'm going to do is to offer you 2 different musings. I'm going to offer you a Western understanding, in the sense of this painting, the subject matter of this painting. And I'm going to offer you an indigenous understanding. And that's how I'm trying to figure this all out. But if you have better ideas, like, join me in trying to figure out this. So, next slide. Before I can offer you either an indigenous or non-indigenous framework, I have to provide a little bit more context. So this is a medicine wheel, and it is depicting our 4 different genders. Our men and men, our men's camp, Napueo, sit in the north. Our Esquia sit in the south, south for summer, rapid growth. Our female assigns sit in the east for new beginnings, and our male assigned individuals sit in the west. And so that's our medicine wheel. And our social convention for us as Crees is that we would never have, and also a part of this too is that I've yet to find a word in those 9 slides that we had of Two-Spirit. You'll notice that auspiciously missing from any of the definition were gay, lesbian, or bisexuality. It was like moon instructed by the moon. They have a pattern, coward, fake man, fake woman. But I have yet to find a word with any of our indigenous languages that translates into gay or lesbian or bisexuality. We don't have that framework. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. If it exists, I will, I just have yet to find that. Yeah.
Does Two-Spirit also cover those who are non-binary? The reason I ask that is also following up with what this person over here said about roles. And if someone who's non-binary doesn't feel, male or female, then how would that play into Two-Spirit?
Well, that's what I think Two-Spirit is.
Okay.
Except when we say non-binary for Two-Spirit, it's putting it into a Western framework and strips the culture and the centering of one's ingenuity, because non-binary becomes general. But yeah, I think in the crudest sense is that Two-Spirit is non-binary, falls under that framework, but it is absence of culture and one's ingenuity. So because I haven't found a word for gay or lesbian or bisexuality, and also just building upon this is a Cree medicine wheel. We had a social convention in which 2 men from that gender, that camp, couldn't hook up and have sex within that camp. 2 women couldn't hook up and have sex within their gender. We don't have those words, right? And what held true for these genders held true for these genders. It was a social taboo for me to hook up and bump uglies with another male assigned two-spirit person. So I, as an Iyakwe, I would often take a straight man as my husband. And because we're having sex outside of our gender, we would be considered straight. Again, we don't have that word. Like I'm providing it. Like we're heterosexual normative, meaning that you just cannot have sex within your gender. Similarly, our female assigned individuals would take straight women as their wives. And again, because they're having sex and sexual relations outside of their gender, that's the convention. You just cannot have sex within your camp or your society. So, from a Western framework, if we go back to that painting, go forward. This is work that was started in 1948 by McKinsey, Albert Kinsey, who was a sexologist. And what Kinsey was looking at in 1948, and it was a seminal report, he was looking at, it was like, not like, how did people identify, like, like what was their sexuality? Are they gay, bi, or ambi-bisexual? He was like, no, actually, who are you physically attracted to, or who are you actually having sex with? And so his study was looking at sexual behavior in the human male population. Okay, and it was highly problematic. Kinsey was like jumping into bed with research participants. All of his research participants were white. There were no people of color. But it was also Kinsey that showed and made that declaration that 10% of the general population is gay. And what Kinsey showed is that, and here, this is his framework, is that the scale from 0 to 6, it was known as the Kinsey 6 scale. What they showed was, Kinsey showed that 10% of the general population, well, for his, it was white females, were exclusively heterosexual in behavior. And he also showed that 10% of his sample size was exclusively homosexual in behavior. But that 10% has really never been replicated. The highest I've seen of studies is around 5.6% of the general population is between heterosexual and homosexual. When the lowest I've seen is less than 1%. So if you just hit the button once. So I just eyed it. I just said approximately around 3.5% of the general population of us today are straight. And around 3.5% roughly are gay or same-sex sexual attraction. And so from those, the framework has changed, like the name, but we still use this gradient, right? And it's these numbers like on opposite ends of the poles, right? So if we take 3.5% plus 3.5%, that equals what, 7%? But that leaves us 93% of us that have a much more muddy, nuanced, gray, complex conception of who we find attractive. And I think our old ones knew that. And you can see that from that painting. Like, the warriors, like only one lucky warrior was chosen. He was lucky. But all the other ones were like dancing, but they were honoring that I'm going to vie for the sexual attention. Like they don't have to act on it, but they have to honor that that is a part of where they are. Now, this framework is in our societies today, and it's changing. Like we see much more people of like sexually diverse folks. But when I was growing up, if someone was like plotted 4.2 on that scale, they were left in a very awkward position. In that they would have to make a choice. Do they choose to be gay and wall off and deny all of this opposite sex attraction? Or worse, do they just say that they're straight and they wall off and deny all of this same-sex sexual attraction? And so I think, again, for 93% of us, we have a much more muddy, nuanced, gray conception of sex, sexuality. But we don't have an identity. And we just like affirm this binary. And you're gonna say, well, Harlan, what about the bi people? We do such a crap-ass job of honoring, of lifting up, and celebrating our bi relatives. The gay community looks at them with suspect. You're just confused. The straight people are like, maybe you just haven't found the right person. And so I take them out of the equation because we do not honor our bi relatives. But you can clearly see from this that 97% of us have some, what Kinsey calls it, abisexual behavior. That's us today. And you all know what I'm talking about. Because in the multiple nights, the quiet of your mind, you all know what I'm talking about. Only 7% of us, well, this would be oversampled, right? But general population, that only 3.5% of us can say that we're straight, and only roughly around 3.5 of us can say that we're exclusively homosexual behavior. The rest of us, we're not. And so to your question of like, how do we make sense of those warriors? Can you still be a part of the Nēhiyo camp, yet still bump uglies with another male-assigned individual? And what is that? And we don't have a language, or do you see how I'm even struggling to like bridge that? So that we would actually have a day in which that our heterosexual men would come together to do a dance to me. But that's what we did. And so what I share with you is like, the warriors on this end of the spectrum, the one who today be like dancing like this, right? The warriors over here be like, hey! So that's a Western framework. And the indigenous understanding is a teaching that I got from Sharon Day, who's Anishinaabe, second-degree Mudjaywan. She's also the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Task Force. She's also Two-Spirit. When Sharon looked at that painting, she was like, what my teachings would be is that for a vast majority of us, we have sexual desires and wants. We can't say all, because there's asexual people. But a vast majority of us have sexual desires and wants. And attractions. And those attractions are temporal and context dependent. Time and space. In that, who you find attractive could change minute by minute. I go to a gym, and I see some male-assigned individual that's curly, and it's like, holy, right? Next minute I can get in a yoga class, and I see a female-assigned individual doing a beautiful back bend, and I'm like, it's so beautiful, right? Or it can change over a lifetime of who you thought were attractive when you were 16 is not who you think is attractive when you're 30 or 40. So it can change minute by minute or over a lifetime, tempo. And that it's also context dependent of where you are. And you know what I'm talking about is when you see someone who's walking their truth, they're going to be attractive. Independent of assignment, you are going to be attracted to them. And so it's always going to be context dependent. And so, in this respect, it is like a sex circularity. In that rather than having a fixed point on a scale, is it just floats and changes. And one day you could be dancing your heart out for a kukua, so the next day you're trying to position yourself for a female-assigned individual to be attracted to them. And then it just goes round and changes minute by minute or over. And so, again, this is a critique of genderbread, where sexual orientation is an internal conversation, but we need that external validation. What's the assignment of who I find attractive? where why don't we have just sex circularity? I find you attractive. No, I find you attractive. No, I find you attractive. And then we all are sex circular. Why do we have to create these subdivisions of like, no, you're a lesbian. No, I'm gay. Oh, no, you're bisexual. Or some other term. Why can't we just say, oh, I'm attracted to people, and that we all are sex circular, and just leave it at that, about just a sexual being on the planet, for our non-asexual relatives? Yes?
I'm curious about the painting in the context of my teachings is about we honor transition. So in our culture, local culture, young girls have a flower dance ceremony or an ihuk in Karuk lands, and it honors a girl's transition from being a young person to an adult person. And so I'm curious about the painting as, could it have been a dance to celebrate or honor a person's, like, at what point in Native culture is there like this child and then becomes an adult who chooses an identity? And so I'm curious about, like, could that painting be related to a celebration of this person's choice to become something as opposed to sexualizing? Because I don't know if our people, Native people, or at least local people, had a strong desire to sexualize as much as we do now. You know what I mean? Where I don't really think it was all kind of like, I think modern society has definitely objectified one another's bodies to the extent of selfish self-pleasure. You know what I mean? And I don't think that was, I don't think that it could have existed for Native people simply for population control. You know what I mean? And how you can only catch as much fish as you can, and you can't feed so many people, right? So I'm curious about our need right now to even sexualize that picture instead of it being about transition and choice, self-selection of identity.
No, perfect. I have a little gift for you because and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. In that, what I would like to separate out, just go back to the slide, baseline. So this is not a coming of age ceremony. This is a war party ceremony, right? And so what you're bringing up is how did we identify our two-spirit relatives? Like, just similar, like a coming of age of our young women when they start their moon cycle, right? And we had ceremony and protocols. We have very similar sort of protocols, right? Or how like, we take our young men and they do their, like in our way, they have to go out and they have to go on a hunt and they have to make their own kill. And then they're issued back into camp as a man. So they go out as a boy and they can come back as a man. No different from when our women begin their moon cycle. Our girls begin their moon cycle, and we wake up and then we have the ceremonies and they're welcome to the women. And they're taught how to be a woman. That's not what this painting is about. I do know that for our Sioux relatives, when an individual, how did we find out, and what was the transitioning or the ceremonies that existed that identified our two-spirit relatives? So for our Sioux people, if you had a dream of a double-faced woman, Vishkashka, and you told someone of that dream, you immediately schooled them what it meant to be a two-spirit person for our Sioux people. For us as Cree people, when we go on our vision quest, when we're like fasting for 4 days with no water and food, and we're in solitary, and we're connecting with the great creator, and we're given a purpose, and if our purpose is that we're two-spirit, we come back and we tell people, and we're schooled in what it means to be two-spirit. Nothing sexual around that. It's what your role within society. For the Mojave people, this sounds really harsh, is this didn't happen to everyone. And the documentation that I've seen in the archive is only for our male-assigned individuals. I get to find what was the corresponding for a female two-spirit person. But when they had like gender diverse young males, sometime between the ages of 9 and 11, You know, the ones that wanted to play with the girls and play with Barbie dolls. You know, little sissy boy. What the family would do is they would build a wigwam with the door facing east for new beginnings. And on one end of the wigwam, they would place a basket emblematic of women gathering. And then on the other side, they would put a bow emblematic of men hunting. And then that young male-assigned individual would be asked to go to sleep inside the wigwam. And once they were asleep, the entire community would come together, and then they would light the wigwam on fire. Sounds harsh, but just a little, right? Whatever, right? But what the ceremony was that in this heightened and frightened state, the individual had to be true to who they were. And I want to take it out of the language of choice. They weren't choosing anything. In this heightened, frightened state, they had to be true to who they were. And so they're like, oh, the wigwam's on fire, right? If they grabbed the bow and they ran out of the camp, out of the wigwam with the bow, they would immediately be making the pronunciation that they were of the men's camp. And they would be ushered over and they were taught and schooled on what it was to be a warrior. If they came out with the basket, they would make the pronunciation that they were a true spirit. And they would immediately be ushered over to that camp and they would school in what was that role. Now, that's harshness of like setting the word, because they would be like, but from the archives and the stories that I've read, is that the individual, like if there was imminent danger, the young person would be like, screw the basket, screw the bow, my babies are on fire, I gotta get out of here, right? But they knew that they had not a choice, but they had to be true to what their spirit was. And so they always emerged with one item, their truth. And so we have these, I shared those three ceremonies, and you can see it's not sex. It's about the role. I was answering the question over here about making this is the dance of the Radash, and it is sex and sexual because we did have same-sex sexual relations, but we didn't classify it as gay and we didn't classify it as lesbian because we just don't have the words or concepts around that. And so separating out the two conversations, this is clearly about sex and sexuality, but it's also decolonizing sex and sexuality. Where our coming of age ceremonies is that we had the ceremonies and they were non-sexual. It was about expressing your truth so that you may walk your truth and you may know your role in society and what are your gifts and medicines that you have to give. And so you bring up such a great point because it's not all about sex. This is cool, but this is only, of course it's cool. But it's not everything. It's about your role being that mediator. Like I wasn't trying to bump uglies with anyone there. I was merely fulfilling my role. So it's both the same. There's a sexual component, but there's also this gender or your role in society, right? And the two can complement and work with one another. But I don't want you to think that we're completely sexualized. Because when I was mediating, there was nothing around sex or sexuality. It was mediating, it was my role. Like no different from men hunting, nothing sexual about that. Women gathering, nothing sexual about that. Mediator, nothing sexual about that. So good on you. Thank you so much for that question. All right, now I've gone way over. I do have some other gifts, so if you want to come up, I have more than enough gifts. So thank you so much.